We don't fund dreams, Doctor. Volkov, we fund reality. The words cut through the prestigious Mars Summit conference room like a knife, silencing the young astrophysicist mid-presentation. Dr. Alexei Volkov's fingers froze on his holographic display as subtle laughter rippled across the audience of billionaires and space industry titans. In his worn blazer with patched elbows, the same one he'd worn to defend his doctoral thesis, he suddenly felt painfully out of place among the tailored suits and designer watches that represented the gatekeepers of humanity's interplanetary future. The exclusive Mars Colonization Summit in Geneva brought together only the wealthiest investors and most connected entrepreneurs, people who could afford the $250,000 entry fee without blinking. Crystal chandeliers reflected off marble floors as waiters circulated with champagne that cost more than Volkov's monthly salary. His presence was an anomaly secured through a last-minute science fellowship that barely covered his economy flight. For 3 years, he had worked alone in his small apartment, developing revolutionary atmospheric conversion theories that could make a self-sustaining Mars base possible decades ahead of current projections. Perhaps you should leave the Mars discussions to those who can actually afford to go there, continued Maxwell Porter, the silver-haired venture capitalist whose investment firm controlled more space startups than any other entity on Earth. The room's temperature seemed to drop as Volkov struggled to respond, his research notes trembling in his hands. What he didn't notice was the man in the back row wearing a simple black t-shirt among all the bespoke suits, who had stopped scrolling on his phone and was now watching the exchange with increasing interest. Alexei Volkov's presentation slides continued to hover in the air behind him, displaying complex atmospheric conversion models and resource utilization projections, 3 years of his life's work exposed to ridicule. The data was sound, revolutionary even. His algorithms showed how a network of small, autonomous conversion units could transform the Martian atmosphere incrementally. Rather than requiring massive initial infrastructure, the approach could reduce colonization costs by 78%, while increasing sustainability metrics tenfold. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he didn't belong in this room. His H&M clearance rack suit amid their Brioni and Tom Ford. His trembling hands holding research papers, while theirs held crystal flutes of Krug champagne and portfolios worth billions. Dr. Volkov, Maxwell Porter continued, his British accent polished to perfection at Eton and Oxford. Enthusiasm is commendable in graduate students, but this is a forum for serious investors. Your DIY approach to Mars colonization is charming, but hardly practical when discussing actual capital deployment. More laughter rippled through the audience. A woman in the third row whispered something to her companion, both glancing at Volkov's scuffed shoes. A man in a titanium wheelchair, the CEO of Orbital Ventures, shook his head with a pitying smile. The conference moderator glanced at her watch, clearly eager to move on to more promising presentations. "I understand the financial constraints, Mr. Porter," Volkov replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. The slight Russian accent he'd worked years to minimize was now more pronounced under stress. "But that's precisely why my approach makes sense. Current colonization models require initial investments of trillions. My distributed system could begin with just a few billion? Pocket change?" Porter interrupted, triggering more laughter. "Young man, Mars isn't a startup you bootstrap from your garage. It's the next frontier of human civilization, requiring serious resources managed by experienced hands." He gestured around the room. "The people here understand what it takes to expand humanity's reach. We've launched rockets, built space stations, deployed satellites. What have you launched, besides academic papers?" The question hung in the air like a verdict. Volkov felt sweat forming on his brow. From the corner of his eye, he noticed several attendees checking their phones, already dismissing him as they moved on mentally to the next presentation. The rejection stung more because he'd believed, truly believed, this audience would see past his appearance to the revolutionary potential of his work. He'd been naive. "My father worked as a janitor at Baikonur Cosmodrome," Volkov said quietly. "I grew up watching launches that I could never be part of, until now." Porter's smile turned predatory. "A touching backstory. Perhaps you should sell it to Hollywood rather than to serious investors." The room's atmosphere shifted subtly. A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged. Porter had crossed an invisible line from professional dismissal into personal cruelty. Yet no one spoke up. Too much money, too many connections were at stake. "Your time is up, Doctor." "Volkov," the moderator announced, relief evident in her voice. "We need to maintain our schedule." Volkov stared at his simulation, a beautiful, efficient system that would never see the light of day. His hands clenched around his presentation, remote, knuckles white. 3 years of work, dismissed in 5 minutes. He thought about his tiny apartment in Zurich, the stack of rejection letters from aerospace companies, the mounting student debt, and the calls from his mother he'd stopped answering because he couldn't bear to tell her he was failing. "Thank you for the opportunity," he said, mechanically, beginning to gather his materials. In the back row, the man in the black t-shirt put his phone down completely. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Unlike everyone else in the room looking away from the uncomfortable scene, Elon Musk was now watching Volkov with complete attention, his eyes narrowed in thought, head tilted slightly in the way that had preceded some of the most disruptive business decisions in recent history. As Alexei Volkov moved to exit the stage, Maxwell Porter raised his hand. "Actually, I have a proposition for Dr. Volkov before he goes." The audience stirred with renewed interest. Porter was known for occasional acts of professional charity, offering talented but naive newcomers modest roles in his ventures, then taking credit for their innovations. "Your atmospheric conversion theory does have some academic merit," Porter continued. "OrbitCap might have a junior research position available, not leading a team, of course, but contributing to our established Mars initiatives. We're always looking for enthusiastic support staff." The words landed like carefully crafted bullets. Not an outright rejection, but something almost crueler, an offer designed to diminish rather than elevate. Volkov would enter Porter's corporate machine not as an innovator, but as a cog, his breakthrough ideas absorbed and attributed elsewhere, while he was kept financially dependent and professionally invisible. Several executives nodded approvingly. This was how the game was played. Find bright minds, assimilate them, control their innovations. Porter's generosity would be discussed over cocktails later as noblesse oblige toward a promising but unpolished talent. "That's—" Volkov hesitated, understanding exactly what was being offered. A devil's bargain, financial stability, in exchange for surrendering his vision. His mother would tell him to take it. After all, hadn't she cleaned hotel rooms for 30 years to give him opportunities? Who was he to reject any path forward? "The position includes a competitive salary and relocation to our Cambridge facility," Porter added smoothly. "We'd need an answer today, of course. Opportunity knocks but once, as they say." The room watched expectantly. This was the natural order reasserting itself. The young scientist should be grateful for the chance to join the ecosystem, even at the bottom. Volkov looked at his presentation, still hovering behind him, displaying a Martian habitat that would never exist as he had designed it. Something inside him began to harden against the pragmatic choice. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Porter," Volkov said, his voice finding new steadiness. "But my system is designed to work independently of current industry approaches. Integrating it with existing frameworks would negate its core advantages." Porter's practiced smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Independence is a luxury, Dr. Volkov, one typically purchased with capital. He gestured around the room, which, forgive me for pointing out, you conspicuously lack. A silver-haired woman in the front row, the CEO of a major satellite manufacturer, nodded. Maxwell's being more than fair. You need infrastructure, launch capacity, supply chains, things that take decades to build and billions to maintain. Or possibly, came a new voice from the back of the room, he needs none of those things. That's rather the point of his proposal, isn't it? Heads turned. A subtle current of recognition rippled through the audience as the man in the black T-shirt stood. Elon Musk moved toward the front of the room with unhurried confidence. Unlike Porter's calculated movements designed to command attention, Musk walked with the slightly awkward authenticity of someone whose mind was already 3 conversations ahead of the current one. "Mr. Musk," the moderator said, momentarily flustered, "we weren't expecting you to speak until the afternoon session." "Change of plans," Musk replied, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the holographic Martian habitat still rotating behind Volkov. "I find myself interested in Dr. Volkov's presentation." Porter's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. As a rule, he maintained cordial public relations with Musk while privately considering him a chaotic element in the otherwise orderly business of space commercialization. More problematically, Musk was the one person in the room whose opinions couldn't be managed through Porter's extensive network of financial relationships and favors. "Elon," Porter said with practiced familiarity, always full of surprises, though perhaps we should maintain the conference schedule rather than derailing it further. Musk approached the stage, hands in his pockets, eyes still fixed on Volkov's atmospheric conversion model. "Interesting approach," he said, ignoring Porter entirely. "You're using soil bacteria modified for perchlorate reduction, combined with cyanobacteria for oxygen production." A murmur went through the room. Some executives exchanged confused glances. Others quickly opened their tablets, suddenly concerned they'd missed something important in Volkov's presentation. "Yes," Volkov replied, surprise evident in his voice. "With modified extremophile bacteria from Antarctica and the Atacama Desert as starting populations. They'd create expanding habitable air pockets without requiring massive initial infrastructure." Musk nodded, gesturing for Volkov to advance to the next slide. "And these conversion nodes are linked algorithmically to distribute themselves optimally across geographical features?" "Exactly," Volkov said, his earlier nervousness replaced by genuine excitement as he flicked to a new simulation. "Each unit weighs less than 50 kilograms and can be deployed from a single landing vehicle. They communicate via mesh network to coordinate conversion efforts, adapting to local conditions without central control." The room's atmosphere had transformed completely. Executives who moments ago had been checking emails now watched intently. A venture capitalist who specialized in biotech was filming the exchange on her phone. Maxwell Porter stood frozen, his expression a carefully controlled mask hiding his internal calculations. "Decentralized, adaptive, and scalable," Musk said with a slight nod. "Using the Martian environment itself rather than fighting it. How do the units reproduce?" 3D printing using local regolith," Volkov replied. "Each parent unit can produce 5 offspring before depleting its terrestrial materials. After that, they're 100% Martian-sourced." Something almost like a smile flickered across Musk's face. "So a single payload could theoretically generate an exponential conversion network across an entire planetary region." "Yes," Volkov said, his voice stronger now. "One mission, one payload, self-expanding across the surface. No additional launches needed." Porter's voice cut through the exchange. "This is all highly speculative. The regulatory hurdles alone are significant," Musk finished for him, turning to face the room for the first time. But so was landing rockets vertically when everyone said it couldn't be done. Maxwell Porter moved to the center of the room, adjusting his cufflinks, a subtle power move he'd perfected over years of boardroom battles. While we all respect Elon's achievements, I think we should maintain some scientific rigor here. Dr. Volkov's proposal essentially amounts to contaminating Mars with Earth bacteria on an unprecedented scale. The planetary protection protocols alone would apply if Mars were pristine, Musk interrupted. But we've already sent dozens of rovers and landers. The contamination ship has sailed, as it were. Porter's smile tightened. There's a vast difference between controlled scientific missions and deliberately releasing self-replicating biological agents across an entire planet. True, Musk conceded, turning to the audience. It's the difference between taking photographs of a new continent and actually building settlements there. A low murmur spread through the room. The confrontation was no longer just about Volkov's proposal, but about two fundamentally different visions for humanity's future in space. This isn't just a technical discussion, Porter countered. It's about responsibility, about who decides how humanity expands into the solar system. He gestured around the room. The people here represent trillions in capital, decades of aerospace experience, relationships with regulatory bodies worldwide. We understand the complexities that go beyond clever algorithms and bacterial cultures. The room nodded in agreement. This was familiar territory, the established order reasserting control through appeals to experience, capital, and caution. These complexities, Porter continued, require mature institutions to manage them. Dr. Volkov's bootstrapped approach might sound appealing to those who don't understand the full picture, but in reality, Mars colonization must be, a carefully orchestrated effort led by established players. He paused. With all due respect to disruptive innovations, the phrase, a subtle jab at Musk's career, landed precisely as intended. Several executives smiled appreciatively. Porter had masterfully reframed the discussion from specific technological merits to broader questions of authority and control, a battlefield where his network of financial relationships and institutional connections gave him overwhelming advantage. Volkov watched the exchange with growing dismay. The debate was slipping away from the scientific merits of his work and into a power struggle between industry titans. Musk turned to him with an unexpected question. Dr. Volkov, how much would your initial prototype deployment cost? The room fell silent as Volkov hesitated, then answered quietly. Approximately $15 million for the first mission, another $20 million for the expanded test network. His voice grew stronger. That's several orders of magnitude less than conventional approaches. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Even the smallest Mars initiatives typically discussed budgets in billions. Musk nodded. And you've built a working lab prototype? Yes, Volkov said. It's currently running in a simulated Martian environment at ETH Zurich. Small scale, but proving the core principles. Porter interjected smoothly. Lab experiments are a far cry from planetary deployment. The liability issues alone would be insurmountable for any responsible institution. Responsible, Musk repeated, the word hanging in the air. An interesting choice of term. He turned to face the room directly. When did we decide that humanity's expansion to other planets should be the exclusive domain of those with the deepest pockets rather than the best ideas? The question landed like a stone disturbing still water. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one is suggesting exclusivity, Porter countered, but there's a natural order to innovation. Breakthroughs occur within ecosystems that can support and scale them responsibly. Natural order, Musk repeated, like the natural order that said electric cars would never compete with combustion engines, or that reusable rockets were impossible, or that the internet would only ever be used by government researchers? He turned to Volkov. Continue your presentation, Doctor. I'd like to hear about your deployment timeline. Porter's voice hardened. This is becoming absurd. We're giving serious consideration to a proposal that would essentially represent biological pollution of an entire planet based on unproven technology, championed by a researcher with no field experience, no institutional backing, and no understanding of the regulatory landscape. And that, Musk said quietly, is precisely the problem with our current approach to space. He stepped forward, addressing the entire room. We've created a system where the price of admission to building humanity's future isn't the quality of your ideas, but the size of your bank account. The room tensed. Musk was crossing an unspoken boundary, challenging not just Porter, but the entire assembly of space industry elites. We sit in rooms like this, Musk continued, congratulating ourselves on our vision while systematically excluding anyone who doesn't already belong to our club. We've replaced the government gatekeepers with private ones, and then we wonder why progress is so slow. Porter's expression darkened. This isn't about inclusion, Elon. It's about competence, about the difference between theoretical models and actual mission execution. Is it? Musk countered. He gestured toward Volkov. Because what I see is exactly the kind of thinking that transforms industries, decentralized, adaptive systems that leverage local resources instead of shipping everything from Earth. Exponential rather than linear deployment. Biology working alongside machinery. He paused. And most importantly, an approach that doesn't require being a billionaire to participate in humanity's expansion to Mars. The momentum in the room had shifted palpably. Several investors were now openly studying Volkov's presentation slides with new interest. A young venture capitalist was discreetly recording the exchange on her phone. The moderator had abandoned any pretense of keeping to the schedule. Porter made one final attempt to regain control. This is all very inspiring, but inspiration doesn't build Mars colonies. Capital, experience, and institutional knowledge do. Dr. Volkov's approach, while creative, simply isn't viable without the infrastructure that companies like mine have spent decades building. Actually, Musk said, I think it is. He turned to Volkov. Dr. Volkov, I have a proposition for you. Not a junior research position, but a full development partnership. Your atmospheric conversion system integrated with SpaceX's Mars transportation architecture. The room erupted in murmurs. Volkov stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. But, Porter sputtered, the regulatory framework alone will adapt, Musk finished for him, as it always does when the technology is compelling enough. That's how progress actually happens. The Mars Colonization Summit adjourned early that day, the usual structured proceedings giving way to clusters of excited conversation. Executives who had dismissed Volkov hours earlier now hovered nearby, business cards discreetly offered. A Japanese telecom billionaire asked for a photograph together. A Brazilian aerospace manufacturer suggested exploratory discussions. The transformation was as swift as it was transparent. Volkov barely noticed them. In a quiet corner of the conference hall, he sat across from Elon Musk, watching as the tech mogul sketched modifications to his atmospheric conversion design on the back of a conference program. Your bacterial cultures could be transported in these modified payload bays, Musk explained, drawing rapidly. We've been working on a new Starship variant specifically for Mars surface deployment. Lower payload capacity but much higher precision landing capabilities. Volkov nodded, still processing the sudden reversal of his fortunes. My system would need to be scaled up significantly from the lab prototype. That's the easy part, Musk replied, continuing to sketch. The hard part was coming up with the approach in the first place. He looked up. How soon can you relocate to Texas? Texas, Volkov repeated. Starbase. You'll need direct access to our engineering teams. Musk passed him the sketch. Can you start next month? 6 weeks later, Dr. Alexei Volkov stood on the observation deck at Starbase, watching as technicians loaded his atmospheric conversion units into a test starship. His small team, 5 researchers recruited from universities worldwide, monitored the loading procedure on their tablets, occasionally conferring about packaging angles and deployment sequences. His phone buzzed with a news alert. The business press had finally caught wind of his partnership with SpaceX. Unknown scientist partners with Musk on revolutionary Mars approach, read the headline from Bloomberg. Another notification followed immediately. Maxwell Porter had issued a statement expressing concerns about untested biological approaches to Mars colonization, calling for regulatory oversight of freelance planetary modification efforts. Volkov smiled slightly as he pocketed the phone. Porter's institutional advantages, his connections, his political influence, his financial leverage, were formidable. But they were also, Volkov now understood, constraints. The very networks that gave Porter power also limited his ability to embrace truly disruptive approaches. Dr. Volkov, final checks complete. One of his team members approached with a clipboard. The bacterial cultures are secure and in stasis. Deployment units are showing green across the board. Volkov signed the approval form, watching as the starship's loading bay doors closed on the first phase of a new approach to making Mars habitable. 1 year later, Volkov returned to the Mars Colonization Summit. This time, he entered through the main doors rather than the service entrance. This time, he wore a simple but well-tailored suit rather than his patched blazer. This time, he was a keynote speaker rather than a desperate petitioner. The main conference screen showed real-time footage from Mars, a network of his atmospheric conversion units spreading across Arcadia Planitia, each one processing the thin Martian atmosphere into increasingly oxygen-rich microclimates. The first units had already reproduced, creating second-generation nodes that were expanding the network exponentially. As he prepared to take the stage, Volkov noticed Maxwell Porter standing with a group of executives across the room. Their eyes met briefly. Porter gave a slight professional nod, acknowledgement without concession. Volkov returned the nod as he walked to the podium. He understood now what he hadn't a year ago. The future of humanity's expansion into space would not be determined solely by those with the most capital or the most connections. It would be shaped by those with the courage to challenge established approaches, to imagine solutions unconstrained by traditional thinking. As he began his presentation, he saw a familiar figure slip into the back row, Elon Musk, in his trademark black T-shirt, already looking at his phone, already thinking about the next impossible problem to solve. The future belonged to the bold.